This video is about numeric user input. So in Python, when you are getting input from uh, the user's entering input on the keyboard, we use the input function. Now, so far, the only examples we've seen is where the user was entering in some text as input. For example, the first name, the last name. So that was string input. The data type was string. But what if the user wants to enter numeric input, and that numeric input will be stored in a variable, in a numeric variable, so that later on in the program we can do some numeric calculations with that input. So if the user input needs to be treated as a numeric data type so that it can be used in numeric calculations, then we need to convert the user input to the appropriate type. Whether it's a float, that means it's a number with a decimal point, or if it wants to be treated as a whole number, which would be an int. So the Python input function, when it reads the text that's input, it always reads it as a string, even if the text that's input is just numbers. And let's look at two examples. Here's the first example, and I'm going to open it at this program and see what happens. So the first line of code is a print statement, and it prints this text. It says this program prints the difference of two numbers. And then we can see that there are two inputs. So it's going to print the difference of two numbers entered by the user. So the user is going to enter in two inputs. Enter the first number, then enter the second number. Now the input is read in or treated as a string by the input function. So the variable on the left hand side of this input, on the left hand side of the equal sign, is named num1 string. And then this num1 string is passed as an argument to the function int. So int is already a function in Python, and it takes a string in as an argument, and it converts it to an integer whole number, and that's what num1 is going to get. Num1 is going to become the integer which was the same as num1 string. So it's converting the string into an integer. Then we do the same thing with num2. We ask the user for input, enter second number that is stored in the variable num2 string, and then num2 string is the argument for the int function, which is already built in Python, which takes that string and converts it to a integer, and that is stored in the variable num2. And then we do the arithmetic here. So we subtract from num1, we subtract num2, and we can do this because now num1 and num2 are integers, and then the difference will be the difference of the two integers, and then we'll print num1. So the first number, a comma will give you a space and a minus sign, and then the second number equals, and then the result. So let's run this. So it says this program prints the difference of two numbers entered by the user. That's just a descriptive text that we had in a print statement. And it says enter first number, and I'll enter 100, and then it will say enter second number, and I'll enter 50, and then it will say 100 minus 50 equals 50. So it shows the calculation. So let's try and understand what happened here and match the Python code with this input. So the first thing that this program does is the print statement, and it prints this title. This program prints the difference of two numbers entered by the user. That's the whole first line, which is what we saw here. I've kind of shrunk my window so it's like it's in two lines, but it's in one line. And then the next line of code is an input, and it says enter first number as a prompt. And then we see num1 string is assigned the string value of num1, because that's how the input works. It's a string, and then we need to convert this num1 string to an int by calling the int function on that num1 string, and then we'll get num1, which is an integer. Then we'll do the same for num2. Enter the second number. We store that string that the input returns, the input function gives us a string that's called num2 string, and then we convert num2 string to an integer by giving it to the int function here. The int function gives us the integer version of that num2 string, which we store in num2, and now we can do the calculation here. Now, so it does num1 minus num2. In my case, it's 100 minus 50, so difference is 50. And then it prints num1. Num1 is the integer, so it prints 100. And then it prints a space, and then it puts a dash, which is a minus sign, space, and it prints num2, which is 50, and then the equal sign, and then the difference, which is 50. I can run this program one more time, and let me enter 5 as the first number and 3 as the second number, and it prints 5 minus 3 equals 2. So just to show you, if I say x, so this is in my Python shell, I'm just typing in some code. I say x gets input, please enter a number, and I run it. It asks me for a number. Let's say I enter 345, and then if I say x, it shows me the string 345. So you can see that x is a string, and now if I say x minus 1, I should get 344, but it is going to crash because it's going to say that this was an unsupported operand type for minus. So I use the dash as a minus sign. I used it for a string and an int, and that doesn't work. So x, so what is x? X is still 345. So now if I say int x, this is the name of a variable, and I say that is calling the integer function on x. So I'm saying take this number x, not the number, take the string x, string 345, and I call the int function on it, and I store that in this variable int x, and I find the value of int x. Now it's an integer. So now if I do int x minus 1, then I'll get 344. So this is to show you that the input, even though it's saying please enter a number, and I did enter a number, that number got stored in the variable x as a string and not as an integer. And so before we can do any calculations with x, before we can subtract or add or do any calculations with x, we need to take x and call the integer function on x to convert it into an integer, and then we get an integer, and then we can do calculations with that. So that's how we convert numbers. So there are two built-in functions in Python to convert strings to numbers, and those are int, which we just saw, and float. So here's another example where we'll use the float function and to convert the string to a decimal number. And let me open this in my Python program. This program is called discount, and there's a message. The first line of code is going to display just welcome to discount city. It's kind of misspelled there, and then it's going to ask for input. It's going to say enter the original cost of the item, and then it's going to say enter the discount as a decimal. And so the original cost of the item is being input, and immediately in the same line of code we are going to call the float function on the input. So it's going to convert the input into a decimal number directly. So we're not doing it in two lines, we're calling the input function first, and then the string that's returned by the input function will be converted to a float by calling the float function, and that will directly be stored in cost. So cost will be a float, and then discount percent will also be a float. It will be the discount as a decimal, and then 1 minus the discount percent multiplied by the cost will give us the discounted price, and then we have two print statements to print out the discounted the cost and the discounted price. I'm just going to add some lines here to show you the way we write programs. In most cases, you don't always have to have a print, but you can. But we do the input steps early on in the program. So in the beginning of the program, we get the input, then we do our calculation, and then we do the output. You may have one or more output. So let's run this and see what happens. And it says, welcome to discount, enter the discount city, enter the original cost of the item. Just to make this easy, I'm going to say the cost of the item is 100. Let's enter the discount as a decimal. Let's say we are getting 50% discount, right? So that would be 0.50. And so it says original cost is 100, discounted cost is 50, right? Because we got a 50% off, so we got half the price. We had to pay half the price. So this was a run of the program. Everything worked fine. And we can see why, because we converted the input into a float. Let's say I forgot this and I delete this. And if I run it, let's see what happens. So enter the original cost of the item, that I'll say 100. Enter the discount as a decimal, I'll say 0.5. So far so good. I'll hit enter and then it crashes, and it crashes at this line, discounted price gets cost times 1 minus discount percent. So the discount percent works fine because that was a float, it subtracted it, but it says cannot multiply sequence by non-int of type float. So this was a non-int is what it's saying. It's saying it cannot multiply this sequence, which is a string, with a float, and that's why we got an error. So if I go back and put in the float, then we know this worked properly before. So if I run this, it will work. Cost of item, let's say I say 50 this time. And then enter the discount as a decimal. Let's say I say 50% again, so 0.50. So then the discounted price should be 25. So this is how we convert numeric input before we use them in numeric calculations. If your numeric input is an int, then you have to call the int function on the input. You can store the input in a variable and then convert that variable to an int. So you need two different variables for each input, or you can do it directly in one step. You can call the input, write the input function, and then convert it to a float or an int in the same step. Just remember that when you're typing this code all in one step, you'll have two close parens on this end. One for the prompt, right? Input, and then you write the prompt in parentheses, and then one for the float function, the parentheses. So you have to close two of them at the end.